All right, hey, gonna do a little video here. I mentioned in one of my other videos I was gonna do some soldering. So that's what I'm gonna kind of demonstrate here. Some of you folks may already be familiar with it, may not, but I wanted to share what I do. I prefer soldering over using crimp connectors. It's a more positive connection, creates less resistance in the line, and it just, by the time you're done, I think it looks much better. So that's my logic behind it. That's what I choose to do. What I do on heavy gauge wire, now what I'm going to do is, excuse me, these are the wires for the in-tank fuel pump for the Corvette. Black and the gray, so these are going to extend into, let me show you, I mentioned before, going into the power distribution module for the Holley Sniper system. So the gray is essentially power, so I'm going to use red for that. Black obviously is standard ground. What I do, because this is a little bit heavier gauge wire, is I'll take one of these crimp connectors and I'll take an X-Acto knife. I end up having to take a pair of needle nose pliers, an X-Acto knife, and I'll cut this insulation and strip that off. And it leaves me, let me see, I can show this here, leaves me with the internals of it. And if you notice, when I put this on the wire, it ends up pretty close to the same diameter as the wire. So but now if I put shrink tubing on there, it's a much cleaner look. And again, I'm kind of a big on the aesthetics sort of thing. So I'm going to use those on heavier gauge wire. Lighter gauge wire, I can strip that back, and I'll go ahead and I'm going to do a video on the wiring harness for the Sniper2 that has some 20 gauge wire, and I'll demonstrate on it where you just wrap it, solder it, and away you go, down the road you go. This is heavier gauge wire, so again, I'm going to use these connectors. Now, one of the things I'm going to do to keep from ending up with a lumpy spot is I'm going to stagger these. So I'm going to cut this one back a little bit. So then what I end up with is I end up with a solder joint here and a solder joint up here. So it doesn't become one big fat spot where the coupling is. So let me grab my, here we go. Grab my wire strippers and let's go ahead and go through the process here. Now this one I went ahead and I already had pre-tinned before I started the video. So tinning is the process of putting solder on it before you do the coupling or the joining. It helps the solder flow much better through the connector. So I highly recommend it when you do it. On the flux, for electrical, always use a rosin flux. There's rosin, and I think the other type is called acid. This is an acid flux. Acid flux is for doing anything other than electrical. The problem with it is it will attack your electrical, and at some point, your electrical is you're gonna have shorts or have problems with it. So make sure you're using the proper flux for that. So let me go ahead and let's get this one tinned in. And again, I'm a big fan, excuse me, I'm a big fan of soldering over butt connectors. I think the end result is much nicer. It looks cleaner, it's a better connection. So that's my personal preference. So these, let's see, this one looks like I need to tin that one. And then we can go ahead and do the coupling on this. This flux is kind of interesting. It almost is like, I don't know what you would call it. It's almost like a honey when it cures or dries. Really weird, really different. This is a new flux that I'm using. So it's a little bit different than what I've used in the past, but I'm giving something different a try, and we'll see how this works out. But it is just, it's different. So, all right, let's see. Okay, it looks like I could trim that just a little bit. And again, I oftentimes will overstrip the wire and then tin it, and then I can come back in and trim it down a little bit. Excuse me. All right, let's get this one side done. While that's cooling, I'll get the other one set up here. Let that one cool. Yeah, that's not taking very well. See if that'll... There we go. Okay, now we got a good connection. All right, and just for ease of working, a little cluttered here. I kind of like working in this direction, I guess. So move those over to this side, and then again, I can solder and feed the wire with this. So this is personal preference on how I like to do it. It just seems to be handier for me. So let's get this. Now let's pre-tin those. And you don't need, I've got a pretty expensive kind of high-end soldering station. It's adjustable as far as the temp goes. You don't have to have anything this elaborate. You can buy one of the inexpensive ones from any of the electronic shops or hobby shops or something like that. And it'll be just fine. As long as you're generating enough heat, it'll be fine. I do a fair amount of soldering, so having a good quality soldering iron is just a preference of mine. All right, let's go ahead and get these soldered in. There we go. A little flux on this. All right. And I just hold it in place like this until it cools off a little bit. That way I make sure that I have a good solder joint. It didn't take. Okay. Sometimes if I'm having a struggle with a solder taking, I'll come down on the end here. You saw me take the solder and kind of feed it in there to make sure I get enough solder in there to get a good connection. So usually tinning it gives you enough to where you're good. There we go, much better. But every once in a while, yeah, it just, for whatever the dynamics are, whatever the reasoning is, it just doesn't take real well. And so I just feed a little solder in through the end, and that takes care of it. All right, let's see, that one's doesn't want to feed in very well. Let's interesting. Okay, let's try. What I'm going to do is, maybe there's a little bit of solder inside there that's not allowing that to feed in. So let's see, I'll get this positioned where I want it. Heat it and then feed the wire in. There we go. Okay, so now we're in. I'm going to feed a little extra solder in there. Hold that in place. Let that cool off. Here we go. All right, there we go. Got a couple of good solder connections here. Let me show those to you. And again, using the crimp connectors, but using them as a solder joint, they end up the same diameter as the wire, so it looks very clean. I'm going to go ahead and put some shrink tubing on it now. Get a couple of pieces. Get a piece of that. Let's see. The other one's set up here. All right. So I've got one of these little butane torches for the shrink tubing. All right, so let me show you what I was talking about doing it staggered. So you can see by trimming them two different lengths, you can see they're extending this out. They're now staggered. So when I go ahead and put my my tubing over the top of this, it won't be a big fat spot. So, but there you are, it's all done. One of the things I wanted to show you folks, let's put the cap on that before I spill it. One of the things that I'm going to try using my wiring, my Sniper2 wiring harness came with this kind of sleeving. I'm sure you're all familiar with this. I don't like this. It seems to melt very easy. I just don't like the look of it. This I like much better. It's, I think this is 1/2 inch. But you can see it coils up on itself really nicely. So you can put your tubing in there, or put your wire rather in there. So I bought some of this. I'm gonna use this to run my wires through, to route them through the car. Again, my Sniper2 came with it on the main part of the harness, but because I got to extend it as well, I'm gonna go ahead and again, I bought some of this, so I'm gonna give that a try. It's supposed to be able to take the heat, so hopefully it will. Hopefully it'll work out really well. I like the look of it much better than again than this stuff. So I'll report back to you folks on that and see what I think of it. So thank you for watching, and I'll probably tie in another video back to back on this when I do the sniper harness, but we'll see how that goes depending on the length of this. I may do it as 2 separate videos, but thank you again. All right, second installment on my Sniper2 and my electric in-tank fuel pump wiring extension that I was doing. You saw the first part of the video where I extended the wires, the leads for the electric fuel pump to run into the PDM. I wanted to kind of bring this little schematic out here, kind of point out what I'm going to be doing on this next segment. So this is the wiring harness coming from the Sniper2, and I need to extend some of these wires to the PDM. I mentioned that this power distribution module, I'm going to put that in the behind the passenger seat in the Corvette where the jack would go. There's some space in there, and that's a good place to put it because space is such a premium in a Corvette. So I've already done this wiring loom for the fuel pump, so all I got to do is route that, and then when I install the PDM, I'll just terminate it there. One of the wires I'm going to be extending would be this blue wire, which I have here. That's the fuel pump trigger. Again, comes off the Sniper2, so that's the trigger to turn on the fuel pump. The pink, which is the switched, and I'll have to run essentially 2 pinks. I've got one coming from the key that I have to run in, and then this one would be outbound, so I'll have to run 2, and I may have to pick up some more pink wire. I've got a 12 gauge red main power, which is this one here that I need to extend. And then let's see what else. White. So white, I'm not using this portion of it, but I do need to run a white from I believe from 13 back to the MSD ignition box. So I do need a white for that. The black and yellow is a fan trigger. I don't have electric fans, so I'm not going to extend that wire at this point. Sometime I may add it on later. And then the 12 gauge black, and again, I have that here as well to extend. So these are going to be the wires that I'm going to work on extending. Let's kind of get to it and see how this progresses. Again, like with the fuel pump, heavier gauge wire, a couple of things that I do is I stagger. Again, I solder everything. I don't use crimp connectors. So to stagger the solder locations, I'm going to trim this one back a little bit so that, again, when it goes into the wiring loom, I don't have a big, thick bundle of coupling in the same location. So let's do the red one first. Trimmed it back a little bit. Let's go ahead and strip the wire on that. This is the wire I'm using to extend, just from a standpoint of ease of working with it. I kind of coiled it up and just left part of it paid out so that I'm not trying to fight with the whole thing. So let's get those 2 ready to go. And again, I'm going to go ahead and get some flux on both of these and tin them or pre-tin them with solder, which is just going to make the whole process much easier. I've had the soldering iron heating up, so should be pretty quick and easy here. I'm not sure if it comes up on the video, but you can see that it just, the solder makes the flux rather makes the solder flow really well. Draws it down in there. I think I'll just switch this around, make it a little easier on myself. All right, those are tin. Now, I mentioned in the last video, I'll take a crimp connector, strip off the insulation, and I'll use this to couple together. That way I don't end up trying to take these two pieces of wire, spin them together, and end up with a big blob. It's just it's a cleaner installation. Again, I like it much better. But now that I've got this tinned, I can trim that back to where I get a good that bottoms out. There is a point where this bottoms out, so I trim it back to just that point. Let me get some flux on that. We'll get this one seated, and then we'll come back and do the other one. And as I mentioned in the first part of the video, or the first video, I'm a fan of soldering connections together. It's a more positive connection, less chance of having resistance in the line. I think it's a more permanent solution than using crimp connectors. They sometimes, if you don't get them crimped just properly, they don't hold. And again, if you've got a spot where it's not crimped well, you create resistance in the line, which in turn results in heat. So it just avoids a lot of problems, in my opinion. All right. Oh, you know what? Before I do, let me get some shrink tubing on here. There we go. That end isn't terminated yet, or doesn't have a lug on it, so I could have put it on afterward, but I try to make a habit of doing it as I'm doing the connections here. All right, get a little solder on that. A little flux, and then a little solder. And you notice I'm just using this applicator just to hold it steady to allow this to cool so that I don't end up with a bad solder joint. There we go, that's done. Let that cool for just a moment. Otherwise, I found I try to too aggressively slip the shrink tubing on. It's still hot, and the shrink tubing starts to shrink before I can even get it on there. So wipe off some of this excess flux. I've got a little bit of a nub thing here from the solder. Let me take that high spot off of there. There we go. There, okay. All right, one done. Rather than run a whole long 20-minute video of me soldering two wires that are the same gauge, I'm going to switch over to one of the smaller gauge wires here and show what I do with that. Again, there's no see me solder two 12 gauge wires together. It's just repetitive of the first operation. So, and with a smaller gauge wire. And again, this is 20 gauge. That wire seems like it's a lot longer than I thought it was. Okay, get this one. And with this small gauge wire, again, let's get a piece of shrink tubing for it. That one right here. What I'll do with this smaller gauge wire is, instead of like I did with the bigger gauge wire with a connector and terminating them inside, I can wrap this. Wrap it like that, and then solder it, and we'll be fine. It's just not as big and bulky as that other gauge wire is, so. All right. And again, that's a 20 gauge wire. So those are the two different gauges that I'm going to do. Again, it looks like I'm 10 minutes into this video. I think that's enough watching me solder. It gets the point across. What I'll do is I'll do a video later on once I've got them all done and I'm ready to install it. I'll probably show the whole loom and show what it looks like once it's all prepped to go. Want to try to get it done. I'm hoping that I can get the car started running by Thanksgiving weekend. I've got some time off, so that's my goal. I'm going to have to kind of jump to it a little bit because still got a fair amount to do. But I hope this video, again, the two videos are helpful as far as doing some soldering. As I mentioned, this is, I don't know what I would call it a high end, but this is an expensive soldering iron, soldering station. You don't have to be that elaborate. As long as you're generating enough heat to melt the solder and to make a good connection, that's all you really need. I'm a big proponent of soldering rather than butt connectors or crimp connectors. Hopefully you'll find this informative to where you may want to try it for yourself. But thank you for watching the video, and we'll see you on the next installment. Thank you.